Hey guys, this is Melissa with Love Covered Life, and in this video we're going to continue answering the question, why does God allow a belief in eternal conscious torment to exist? Last week I made a video on this subject, and in watching that video back I realized that I spent a lot more time addressing the question of why God has allowed incorrect beliefs about him to exist in the past. Specifically, we talked a lot about the sacrificial system and how that was useful and beneficial for the people living under that system. And I spent a lot less time actually addressing the question of eternal conscious torment and why has God allowed a belief in eternal conscious torment to flourish for so long. I gave a basic explanation that we've been coming out of a need for fear-based motivation into an ability to be motivated by love. In this video, I want to dive in and look at ways that the belief in eternal conscious torment has actually served a purpose in moving humanity forward. And what I want to do is give you 4 ways that I think God has used the belief in eternal conscious torment to help certain people. And then I'm going to present several questions that we need to ask ourselves as a society if we want to move to a point where a belief in eternal conscious torment is no longer useful or helpful to us. First, some background. So in Matthew 19:8, Jesus states that God will allow things that are not his original intention because of the hardness of our hearts. Our belief systems as a society are built around our collective state of heart, or you could say around our collective spiritual maturity, spiritual awareness, or state of consciousness, whatever terminology that you want to use to describe it. My views on this are really different from mainstream Christianity. And I don't want to lump everybody together here, but I would say, generally speaking, mainstream Christianity teaches that the earth is basically doomed, right? God's going to save a few people and take them to heaven. But the majority of the world's population will burn in hell forever, and the earth is going to be burned up, and God's going to start over with a completely new heaven and earth. I actually believe that this earth, the entire universe and everything in it, is in the process of being restored. The reasons why I believe that would be a whole series to itself, and maybe we'll dive into that sometime. But I'm just sharing this so that what I say next makes sense. I believe that each one of us individually is on our own journey of spiritual growth and development back into oneness with God. This awakening process is what evangelicals call salvation and sanctification. The rebirth, the awakening to God, the growing into the likeness of Christ. And just as individuals are on their own journey back to God, collectively as humanity, we are also developing back towards God. And as it is a long and messy process, even with individuals, I mean, how many of us have to learn the same lessons over and over and over? How many people live their entire lives in hardness of heart and then soften up at the end, or don't? I mean, how many people live their entire lives and never open their hearts to God? And you know what? God is patient with us. He works with us. And for those who don't soften in this life, there will be further lessons later. But just as it's a slow and messy growth process with individuals, it is even slower and messier with humanity as a whole, because it's dependent on all of us progressing. So this is really easy to see looking back in time. Like I said, last week we talked about the sacrificial system, which was in place for thousands of years. And now we have progressed for the most part to a point where we don't physically take animals and sacrifice them on an altar in an attempt to gain God's forgiveness and favor. But we are still very entrenched in a separation-based, fear-based way of living and interacting with each other and with God. We believe that we are separate. We believe our neighbor is other. And out of this separation and fear-based way of interacting comes a deep ingrainment in a violent and retributive way of thinking. Look at our video games, our movies, our TV shows. We are so entrenched in graphic violence that most of us are just desensitized to it. Look at the way that we treat animals in the food supply, at least in the US. It's completely inhumane, and most of us just go along with it because it's just the way it is, and they're just animals, and we have to eat. We've been at a level of consciousness for a long time where we want to see the bad guy get punished. We are satisfied when the bad guy ends up dead or tortured or worse because he got what he deserved. And that's the best definition of justice that we've had to this point. So it's no surprise that we would project our ideas of justice onto God. Those are just a few examples of how we have been entrenched in a fear and separation based way of interacting with each other. We've been in the process of moving out of this for thousands of years. We see a huge awakening to love happening in the world now. Who knows, it could take thousands of years more until we're truly there. I don't believe that it has to. When we are primarily living out of a consciousness of separation from God, living out of emotions of fear and worry and stress and lack, which leads to greed and abuse and control and manipulation and hostility and violence and retribution, then fear-based motivation is what we are reactive to. It's what we gravitate towards, because society as a whole is not spiritually aware or developed enough to self-regulate for higher motivations such as love and joy and inspiration and a vision of peace and harmony in the world. Because if we don't have it in here, if we're not living out of it, we can't create it out here. We won't be motivated by it because we won't even see it. We won't even know or perceive that it's possible. So we have been dependent on fear-based motivation, and God has allowed it to help move us slowly forward. 4 ways that a belief in eternal conscious torment has served the purpose of helping us to move forward. Number 1, we have needed fear-based motivation to hold evil in check. How many crimes were not committed? How many murders were not committed? How many children were not abused? Do you think over the past hundreds to thousands of years because people restrain themselves out of fear of being cast into hell forever? I have lost track of the amount of times I've heard my grandparents' generation complain about the fact that people no longer have a healthy fear of God, which basically equates to a belief that God will throw you in hell and torment you for all of eternity if you don't get your act together. This has been a powerful motivator in times past. I heard someone say recently, and I cannot remember who it was, but I highly suspect it was Brad Jerzak. The Bible says that fear is the beginning of wisdom, but it's not the end. The end of wisdom is love. But in times past, this, and to some extent definitely still today, this fear-based motivator for people to restrain the darker sides of their nature and not just go out and do whatever they feel like doing. It's been necessary. We probably have no idea how much better and safer a place the world has been and even is today than it would have been if certain people living out of very low levels of consciousness did not have the fear of eternal conscious torment to restrain themselves. Number 2 way that a belief in eternal conscious torment has been useful is in helping the mistreated and abused to find peace. Now, the only reason I'm going to speak to this topic, because it's a very sensitive topic, is because I myself have had a traumatic past. So if I'm pointing the finger at anyone with this, I'm pointing the finger at myself. So today in modern Western culture, we see a huge awakening to the fact that abuse is not okay. And we see this huge movement to stand on the side of the abused and bring justice to the abused. And really, this has been the message of the biblical text for the past thousands of years, and we're just now awakening to this and taking all this credit to ourselves. Look how compassionate we are. We're taking the side of the victim, but really we should have been here thousands of years ago, and we are just now getting to this point. And we're still at a very immature level of actually being able to heal and bring justice and restoration to these situations, because the point that we're at right now is that we cannot say anything about forgiving the abuser without it being construed as you're taking the side of the abuser and you're adding to the abuse. So we're just at the point where we're realizing we have to stand on the side of the marginalized, and we have to heal the abuse, and we need to bring justice to these situations. And it's going to take even longer until we're to the point where we can recognize the abuser as a person created by God, a person loved by God, a person who needs intense healing and rehabilitation, and even longer before we're even desirous or capable of helping them. But this is the point that we have to get to if we want to move past the need for teachings like eternal conscious torment. When I was 14, God told me in no uncertain terms that if I wanted to move forward with him, I had to forgive everybody involved in my past. It's not because he was putting some unreasonable burden on me, it's because it was for me. I had to be able to free myself of that. And it took me 3 years to forgive. And years after that, of dealing with being triggered and working through buried anger and resentment and contempt, and dealing with anxiety attacks and panic attacks. Every time that I thought I was completely done with my past, something else would pop up that I would have to work through. And in full disclosure to you guys, I'm still in therapy today for some of the residual effects of what happened to me as a child. So I'm not speaking from ignorance when I say the path to healing is through loving your enemy. And you can get to a place where you are so full of love and you are so complete and whole and free within yourself that you genuinely, legitimately feel nothing but overwhelming feelings of love for people who have hurt and traumatized you. But there are many traumatized individuals who are still on this journey, and God meets us where we are. He's very patient with us. He understands our hurt, and he allows people to believe that he will torture their enemies in hell forever as a way for them to find peace, to take the next step forward in the process of healing. Better to believe that God will take care of your enemies than to have that burden on you. Do you see what I'm saying? Some people would never be able to believe in a God who would allow their abusers into heaven with them. The idea is repulsive, and they would walk away and turn their backs on a God like that. And even though we know that this state of heart is not the end of the story for any of us, and I say this as somebody who has been on this journey and is still on this journey, I say this with the utmost compassion to anybody who is on this journey. Believing that God is retributive is not the end of the story, but it is a necessary and important step for many. Number 3, a belief in eternal conscious torment can be a lifeline for people who are undergoing intense hardships at the hands of others, including persecution for their faith. So I read an article about this once, and it was a couple years ago, so I don't remember who wrote it or which country they were talking about, but it was arguing for eternal conscious torment based on the fact that Christians in war-torn third world countries place their hope in a God of justice. And to them, this means that God is going to get my enemies back. And the author who wrote this article had experienced this firsthand, and basically his point was, if you take away the belief in eternal conscious torment from these people, you take away their lifeline. They would have no reason left to see any good or hope in the world. And how are you going to tell these people that their enemies who are bombing them and shooting their children and causing devastation, and dead bodies are rotting in the streets, and people are starving to death? How do you look these people in the eye and tell them that those who have caused all of this pain devastation, those who have ripped your lives apart, these people will eventually be let into heaven with you. So obviously Jesus did teach that we need to love our enemies. The point is, as always, compassion, understanding that not everybody has the same experience and that people have reasons for believing the way they do, that God knows the heart. God knows the deepest experience of every person's heart. And he loves us unconditionally and without judgment. And he will allow us to believe a doctrine like eternal conscious torment about him, something that so maligns his character, if it brings us peace, if it brings us comfort, if it gives us a lifeline. Number 4, eternal conscious torment preaching has brought countless thousands to Jesus Christ. There's no arguing that it's been very effective in times past. It's not effective today at all. And people are very non-receptive to fire and brimstone teaching today because we've moved past the need for that. We can see right through it now. But in times past, how many people were saved under the teaching of Jonathan Edwards, George Whitefield, John Wesley, Martin Luther, John Calvin? These great awakenings and revivals that happened in the past, they were incredibly effective at bringing people to Christ, and that's why the church is looking for something like that to happen today. And there, in a lot of cases, seem to be blind to what God is actually doing because it looks very different today. Another thing would be people who have sinned, in their opinion, so egregiously that they need to believe they're being saved from eternal conscious torment in order to accept forgiveness for themselves. But what happens is that as we progress in spiritual maturity and our awareness of God within us begins to expand and awaken, we find that we no longer need these fear-based belief systems that were so necessary in the past. We can look right through them and see them for what they are. And it's like, okay, now we're awakened. Now we wonder how we could have ever believed that. But the fact was that it was a necessary step to get us to where we are. Once we begin to go through that awakening process, we become much more easily motivatable by love, joy, inspiration. We can actually perceive and envision peace and healing for the world and everybody in it. Whereas before, those things would have seemed naive, would have seemed impossible. So here's a few questions that we need to ask ourselves, and many individuals are already asking these questions, but as a whole, we need to ask ourselves these questions if we want to progress to a point where a belief in eternal conscious torment is no longer useful for our growth. Number 1, what is our view of justice? Do we get satisfaction out of seeing people get what they deserve? Or can we be motivated by a bigger vision of wanting peace and healing and restoration for anyone, even our enemies? And I'm not saying that we just let evildoers get away with doing evil. What I'm saying is that it's about the heart that we're coming from. So are we coming from a place of wanting to see people get punished for their wrongs for the sake of punishment? Or are we coming from a place of wanting to restrain evildoers for the good of everybody involved? Number 2, as a whole, do we still need a belief in afterlife punishment in order to restrain ourselves and control our actions? Or as a whole, are we capable of being motivated from within? Here's an easy way to tell if we're living out of a state of fear and stress and worry and anxiety. If we're living out of a state of looking for someone to blame for the problems in the world or the problems in our lives, we haven't learned internal management. If we are living our life out of a place of inner peace, joy, love, empowerment, inspiration, then we are at a point where we can start to self-regulate as a society, or as Jesus would have put it, bring the kingdom of heaven to earth where there will be peace and restoration for all. Number 3, do we need a belief in retributive vengeance in the afterlife in order to forgive our enemies? Or have we reached a place where we can genuinely offer compassion and goodwill to those who have wronged us? Number 4, do we need a belief in eternal conscious torment to find peace for ourselves? Are we so entrenched in guilt and judgment and condemnation towards ourselves that we believe we deserve eternal hellfire? Number 5, do we need a belief in eternal conscious torment to bring people to Jesus Christ? And this is one that I can say a resounding no to. Looking at the way that the world is now, people are so hungry to hear about a God who is a loving Father. The other 4, I want to say, we're moving in the right direction. And we just need to keep every single day individually living out of that state of oneness with God within and spreading and creating out of a state of love and joy and inspiration in the world, and doing our part to bring that kingdom of heaven to earth through us by embodying and displaying and demonstrating the love of God. As we progress spiritually, our collective eyes will be opened to the fact that the way to heal the world is to love our enemies. And that this is in fact what God does. And this is what was displayed on the cross. And once we are able to recognize that God loves his enemies, and that there is no such thing as an enemy because we are all one, then we will no longer need to pour out retribution on our enemies in order to heal, in order to accept God, in order to grow. The more we can spread the message that God is love, the more quickly we will outgrow whatever need and dependency we have left for teachings like eternal conscious torment. Please leave your thoughts in the comments. I love hearing from you guys. The discussion has been amazing lately. So keep the comments coming, guys. Be loved, be happy, be at peace, and thank you for watching.